our series this season on stormwater, we've talked about the importance of managing runoff on your property. You want to make sure you practice good water conservation practices and don't really want to dump soil and chemicals and fertilizers into our water system. Today what we're going to look at and talk about is slopes, one of the conditions that really contributes to runoff, and we're going to take a look at some of the ways that we can manage that condition and the materials we'll be able to use to do that. If you decide to stabilize a bank or a slope with a ground cover or plant material of some type, there are some basic points to keep in mind. First of all, if you can, you don't want to expose any more soil than you can cover in a single season. That might be with jute mesh, it might be with an erosion control blanket to be able to plant the plants into it, but you really don't want to have a lot of exposed soil sitting over the winter months. You also want to choose plant material that has the ability to spread fairly aggressively by rhizomes or stolons or by seed in some instances. You want to make sure that that plant is capable of surviving in those conditions for its hardiness, its tolerance of sun, shade, all those sorts of things we talk about on the program all the time in terms of the right plant for the location. You also want to make sure that the root system is capable of holding that soil and that the plant doesn't mound up on itself and create actual little craters where water can wash underneath. One final point is if the plant has great density and if the foliage is capable of capturing water, that will also help slow down any rainfall or any runoff that actually comes and runs down that slope. And that variable surface, that surface that's rough or coarse or broken up with varying sizes and heights of plant material, is also going to help slow the movement of that water down and allow it to permeate into the soil. You can use perennials, grasses, you can use turf, which is a really great ground cover. You can use woody materials or herbaceous materials to stabilize those slopes, as long as they meet those basic conditions we talked about. This is an example of a place where you can see how steep the slope is because we have a flight of stairs in a very, very narrow space with a very steep slope on it. And this is actually a suffrutescent plant called sorbaria or false spirea. That means it dies to the ground every single year. You need to cut it back, but it actually has shrub-like proportions. And this guy is contained by the concrete. Otherwise, it would really spread and fill out a much larger area. This is an example of one of the kinds of things you can use in a large space or a small one if you need a little different scale and a different kind of a texture. It runs underground. It is available oftentimes in bare root earlier in the season, in the spring of the season when it's dormant. So it becomes something that becomes more easily installed than using large containerized materials, and therefore can be a little bit easier on the budget. It's certainly a different kind of a character for stabilizing a slope than the plumbago that we saw earlier or the dendranthema that was going to be coming into bloom. And again, you want to make sure that the plant is going to survive in the conditions in which you place it. This is one that does like this hot, dry, sunny slope in order to perform its best. Your choice of plant materials and design is going to depend a great deal on the severity of the slope and how that slope meets the surrounding grade. If it's nice and gracious at the toe, if it's nice and gracious at the top, you have a different kind of a condition than if you have a slope that's extremely steep. Some of them can be mowable, and this is an example. This is a very, very hot south-facing slope. The turf here is buffalo grass, which of course spreads beautifully, great conditions for it. They have mowed it once or maybe twice, but that's all they had to do on this one. So you don't have to deal with a lot of management issues. You could do the same thing with a well-managed and well-chosen selection of other native grasses if you want sort of a Nebraska-style landscape. A couple of the woody materials that work really well for stabilizing slopes include coralberry. We have a couple of good cultivars to choose from: Chenault coralberry, Hancock coralberry, which will root down at the stems or at the nodes, give you a little different character. You can also use some of the ground cover junipers or even some of the larger junipers. We talk about ground cover and people think it's very, very low, but it doesn't have to be low. It simply has to have those spreading, rooting characteristics that I referred to earlier. And the junipers, of course, give you that evergreen winter texture as well as allowing that water to break up as it is either falling from above or sliding down beneath. Finally, one of the things that you want to be really careful about is not trying to stabilize the slope or hold it long term with just mulch, especially if you've done the wrong thing and placed that mulch on landscape fabric. Mulch ultimately is either going to deteriorate or slide down the hill. Potentially you're then going to be adding that into your runoff situation.